Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Ethan Siegel, Ph.D. He is an astrophysicist, science writer, author, sometimes professor of physics and astronomy, and a longtime Star Trek fan. He has written for Forbes, Scientific American, NASA's Space Place, and many other print and online publications. His award-winning science blog, Starts With a Bang, has been educating the world since 2008. Dr. Siegel, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me here, and good morning, everyone.
It's a real big thrill for me, and I'll just say that on my analog watch on my wrist is a picture of the Starship Enterprise and the word Star Trek. And today's book, Star Trek Treknology, The Science of Star Trek from Tricorders to Warp Drive. It's a great read. It's an interesting read, especially if you're a fanatic of Star Trek like I am. And I guess you are too, aren't you?
You know, I think for me, I grew up with the Next Generation. That was my Star Trek when I was a kid, and you know, I had always been interested in science and how the world worked and how the universe worked and the fact that we could know these things. But what Star Trek gave me when I discovered it was this vision of the future where all of these scientific advances and all of these technological advances that have come about as a result of it, this is what's absolutely fantastic, is that it could alleviate the problems we had on Earth. It could lead to a vastly improved quality of life, and that this was not just some pipe dream. This was something that humanity could actively work towards for the betterment of not only everyone on Earth, but of everyone we'd ever encounter in the whole universe.
Very good. Yeah, I got onto the new generation a little late. I was kind of resistant to part with my original Star Trek. In 1960, I must have been one of those four viewers who was watching on the graveyard slot on Friday night before it was canceled. But the point you just made is eloquently expressed in the book. I mean, at a time when computers were barely powerful enough to calculate astronomical trajectories, we had these visionaries who saw all kinds of technology that the Star Trek crews used: handheld devices, phasers, communicators, electronic clipboards, and a rise of technology that at the time seemed very foreign to most of us.
You know, it's incredible when you think about, for example, the smartphone you carry around in your pocket today. That's more powerful. The computer in there is more powerful than the entire computational power of Earth was back in 1966 when Star Trek first premiered. Mm-hmm. And many of the things you've said, things like flip communicators, electronic clipboards, these are not only, you know, technologies that were envisioned by Star Trek. These are things that now they're almost antiquated how taken for granted they are. When you think about, you know, automatic sliding door, you don't think of that as futuristic technology every time you walk into a supermarket or an airport. You think that, oh, this is something I'm kind of annoyed I have to wait for. When you think about electronic clipboards, you know, you pull out your tablet computer or your smartphone and you swipe, and you wonder what the big deal is. When you think about those flip communicators, you know, we've gone way beyond that. The first flip phone, you know, premiered in the 1980s with Motorola, and now we carry around little devices that are just thousands of times more powerful than that easily. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you take a look at all the different things Star Trek has envisioned, from holodecks to phasers to cloaking devices to visors for the blind to hyposprays, we're well on our way to a huge number of these technologies.
Yes, and I am in awe of how well you know the Star Trek technology as well as how you've connected it with modern technology. It's a really great read. I'd like to go through some of the things in Star Trek technology that are in the book, and I'm going to start with the first one you have, which is warp drive. There's many things we're on our way to having and are already a reality, like tricorders, but we're probably still quite a few decades away from warp drive, aren't we?
You know, I would absolutely agree with that. There are a few technologies that are featured in Star Trek that I think it's important to look at them and say, if we want to make this happen, if we want to make this a reality, what advances would we need? Things like warp drive and transporters and subspace communication and artificial gravity are some of the most difficult ones to have.
Mm-hmm.
When Star Trek first envisioned warp drive, we knew about Einstein's general relativity. We knew that space-time was a malleable entity, that if you curved it enough, you could change the path between 2 points. Well, it wasn't known exactly how warp drive would be possible in the 60s or 70s or even the 80s, but in the mid-1990s, a theoretical physicist named Miguel Alcubierre found a solution to Einstein's equations where if you wanted to go to a star, say 40 light years away, what you could do is if you could construct the right space-time, you could contract the space in front of you from, say, maybe 40 light years down to 1 light year. And the way you could do this was by expanding the space behind you. So if you travel close to the speed of light, instead of a 40-year journey to the star and a 40-year journey back, you could have just a 1-year journey to the star and then turn around and have just a 1-year journey back. So this way, you could actually achieve warp drive. You could go a very large distance in a very short amount of time. But you not only have that advantage, you have the advantage that as you come back, not everyone has aged 80 years. They'll have only aged 2 years. So it's not like you go off to the stars and you're automatically doomed that everyone you love and know is dead. No, you could go there and you could come back, and the faster you go and the more you contract space, the less time passes for everyone back on Earth. The catch is that you need some type of negative mass. If that exists in the universe, then warp drive suddenly becomes possible.
Mm-hmm. The amount of energy required for these massive spaceships is also tricky because we have the challenges with antimatter reactors, of course.
Well, that's a whole other can of worms, but absolutely, there are going to be technical challenges. But the first step is making it physically possible. The second step is overcoming the technical challenges, and the third step is enjoying your futuristic technology.
Well, let's talk about transporters a little bit, because that's something that I see as necessary if we're going to explore other worlds. And yet, transporter technology in Star Trek is more than a few decades away, I suspect.
I suspect so as well. What we can do today is we can do something called quantum teleportation. And this basically says you can take all the quantum information in any system, whether it's a simple one like a single atom or a complicated one like a human being, and you can instantaneously transfer the entire quantum state of that system from one point to another. The way you do this is through a process called quantum entanglement. If I make 2 photons and I create them so that they're entangled, what that means is that I know that one of them is spin up and one of them is spin down, but I don't know which is which until I measure it. Now, the fun thing is I can take one light years away, and just by measuring what's one of them doing, I instantaneously know what the quantum state of the other is, no matter how far away it is. So if I quantum entangle you, the quantum state of an entire human being, and say, we're going to take this to a great distance away, and I'm going to measure what's your quantum state now, I immediately know what that quantum state is super far away. Or if I measure that quantum state on my spaceship that I've taken super far away, I know what everything about your quantum state is immediately. So you can teleport that information. What you can then in principle do is put that quantum state together atom by atom, particle by particle, and create a new human being, a new version of you. The big ethical question that I worry about is, even if we can do that, you use your computer and you do cut and paste, you do Control-X, Control-V, but you could also do copy-paste, where you do Control-C and you delete the original and then you paste it. Those two actions are very different. In the the address, but you leave the original intact. In the copy, delete, paste scenario, you completely destroy the original, although what you copy, what you paste, what you wind up with is indistinguishable to any outside observer. So what I worry about with the transporter is not whether it's possible, but whether that original person that you transport is still alive and still maintains their consciousness at the end, or whether you've killed someone, cloned them, and it's the copy that has all of your thoughts and all of your memories that still exists.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, the biggest obstacle to the transporter is not the fact that moving inanimate objects is hard, or that recreating them is hard. It's the fact that I don't want to do this on a living being until I know it's really you at the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reconstruction of the matter at the other end is the tricky part. But the fact that theoretical and experimental physics is indicating this may be possible after all, I think, is a surprise to some. And sometimes our application of theory works a lot faster than we think. I think back to the telecommunications again. You know, when the Motorola flip phone came out, it wasn't that long before that we all had phones tethered to the wall and rotary dials.
Oh, absolutely. You know, when you take a look at the communicators, right, the idea that you could flip something open and be Kirk to Enterprise, and no matter where they are or how far away you are, you're in touch with whoever you need, that was crazy. That was just craziness to envision back in the 1960s. And then we had these big innovations, the miniaturization of electronics and batteries, a cleverly designed and sized tiny antenna, a network of high-powered transmission towers, and a slew of satellites in space. And suddenly, you and I can talk right now wirelessly from thousands of miles away, and there's virtually no delay.
Let's touch on transparent aluminum, because I found that one interesting in particular. Ever since the Star Trek 4 about taking the whales back in time.
You know, that one was fascinating to me because it's really an example where Star Trek predicted what was coming. They even put the formula for transparent aluminum up on the screen. Well, you know, we've had nanotechnology breakthroughs that make it possible to create these thick, transparent ceramics that are based in this combination of you have aluminum and oxygen molecules bound together in a lattice, and then you add other materials, and there you go. This class of materials was originally applied for a use in lasers because of the compound's transparent nature, but then recently we've started to use it for transparent armor, where things are almost as hard as sapphire, where things are completely transparent to a whole slew of wavelengths of light. This has found its application in things like heat-seeking missiles, and it has the potential to have it in just like the domes of transparent materials, like a pilot's dome in a plane. And this is technology that wasn't supposed to come to fruition in the Star Trek timeline until the 2130s. Yet here we are in the early part of the 21st century, just 30 years after Star Trek 4 came out, and here we are. We knew back then, we had this idea that aluminum would be the key element at play in all of these incarnations, and yet the transparent materials we make with other elements like silicon or boron can't compete with aluminum. Aluminum is the key element, and Star Trek predicted this back in the 1980s. It's pretty incredible. Use in armor, construction, or protection from the environment, this dense, hard, impact-resistant material is right on the money. Transparent aluminum is the way to go.
So science fiction becomes science.
It sure did in that case. They really nailed it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back to the energy question, the antimatter especially. You dealt with the issue of containment, which of course is critical to this. We know so little about antimatter, but we have created antimatter particles, and so we may be on the road to something here as well.
You know, it's really funny because we first detected antimatter back in the 1930s. Using cosmic rays. We would go up in these balloons, we would have these little detectors that would make these magnetic fields in them, and then you'd get to see what sort of track a particle left. And so we knew what electrons would do, and it would turn out that we found particles that were just like electrons, except with the opposite charge. We called them positrons. These are now known as the antimatter counterpart. Well, we've made lots of different antimatter particles, and recently what we've been able to do is we've made antiprotons, positrons, and bound them together to make neutral anti-atoms. We've held these atoms stably together for up to 20 minutes at once. We've been able to do experiments where we've been able to measure their atomic spectra and see they're exactly the same as normal hydrogen spectra. But the next step is going to be to confine large amounts of neutral antimatter together for long periods of time. If you can do that, then you can store it on one side, store normal matter on the other side, and all of a sudden, when the critical time comes, you bring them together and you either release energy in a controlled fashion, like a matter-antimatter reactor, or you release it all at once, and that's how you make a photon torpedo.
Let's talk about some of the other things that are really coming to fruition. The cloaking device is akin to the stealth technology that we've been working on for years.
You know, the amazing thing about cloaking technology is that it's given rise, just this envisioned cloaking device, to a whole field of science called transformation optics. It's not just about stealth technology, although stealth technology was what inspired it, but it's saying let's not avoid absorbing or reflecting radiation. Let's instead take all the radiation, all the light from across the electromagnetic spectrum that comes in, and let's bend it around me so that it moves forward without anyone at a distance ever noticing that I was there. It's a way to remain truly invisible. Well, we have a whole class of materials called metamaterials that make electromagnetic radiation pass freely around an object. It makes a true invisibility cloak a real physical possibility. Simply applying a metamaterial coating under the right conditions is enough to completely cloak or hide a device of any shape. This was demonstrated spectacularly across many parts of the light spectrum, including the radio, the microwave, and the infrared. We have yet to create a true very, very short wavelength cloak where it can extend across the full visible light spectrum and into the ultraviolet. But it will be a Nobel-worthy achievement when the visible portion of the spectrum yields to the advances of transformation optics. And this is a technology that's already well on its way, and it's just a matter of engineering it right now.
Very good. And something I don't think we grant nearly as much credit to as we should is how important deflector shields are for space travel, not just for attacks from an enemy vessel, but all of the little meteorites and rays and all these kinds of things that are going to strike the ship if it's not protected.
Can you imagine how beneficial that would be to be able to protect yourself from space radiation wherever you went, not by building an ultra-thick hull that would eventually be penetrated, but by having, some sort of shield external to you that just prevented things from coming in? That's the hope of a deflector shield. And what we're learning is we can magnetically and electrically confine plasmas at a distance. So if you make a high-energy confined plasma at a distance, it will divert any incoming radiation, and it will prevent a huge number of incoming particles of various energies from striking you. With this technology, you could travel safely through space without having to worry about the long-term degradation of your hull. So this is something that has huge applications in Star Trek, but it also has real-life science and real-life technology that's being brought to fruition.
Do you think someday we'll find a particle called a graviton?
I do think we'll someday find that. I think finding the graviton, if you had asked me 100 years ago, do you think we'll ever detect gravitational waves? I would have said, oh, no way. The effect is way too small, and technology will never get there. Well, the past few years have shown us we can directly detect gravitational waves. And just like electromagnetic waves, light waves, are made out of individual particles called photons, well, gravitational waves should be made out of individual particles called gravitons. Just as finding the photon was only a matter of time, finding the graviton should only be a matter of time and technology as well.
And then when we do, we'll be able to do some other Star Trek things, right?
Oh my, if we find a graviton, so many other things become possible. If you combine graviton technology with warp drive technology, subspace communication becomes possible. If you can manipulate the gravitational force, then inertial dampeners and artificial gravity become possible. This would open the door, if we could find, detect, and manipulate the graviton, to a huge slew of technologies that are presently just out of our reach.
Mm-hmm. Another one that seems out of reach these days is the phaser.
You think so? I'm very optimistic about the phaser. You know, I had thought that, you know, the ability to set something to stun, that you'd pretty much be limited to something like a taser, or you'd be you know, forced to like set it to a kill setting like an ultra powerful laser that you could poke a hole through something. Mm-hmm. But I learned that in the last decade, the United States military has developed an incredible device that's a directed energy weapon. And what it is it's a two-phase plasma pulse. You can say, okay, I'm going to look at my target, and this target, even today, could be up to about 2 kilometers away. You send this first phase pulse, and it's a high-energy pulse. What it will do is it will ionize the electrons in the atoms on the target. So this is something that would even work in the vacuum of space. This first phase pulse, when it arrives at its target, it's going to have this little high-energy pulse that's going to kick the electrons off of the atoms and create this high-energy plasma. Just a very small amount of plasma, completely harmless. That second phase, though, is infrared radiation, and it gets absorbed by the free electrons, which causes that little bit of plasma to explode. Although the plasma is very hot, it doesn't damage anything. Rather, the concussive force of that explosion creates a pressure wave that can knock targets off their feet. It could even knock them unconscious, while the electromagnetic radiation causes extreme amounts of pain by affecting their nerve cells. It effectively disables someone, just as if, you know, you brought your Harry Potter technology and cast Crucio on someone. It would knock them off their feet and cause them to start convulsing, but it won't kill them. It can stun a target on a low power setting, but as long as you have it on that low power setting, it's got no lethal danger. So this could replace not only guns, but even rubber bullets, beanbags, and other crowd control options that are sometimes lethal. This could revolutionize how we do law enforcement by coming up with a non-lethal option for disabling a potentially hazardous target.
Fantastic. And artificial translators?
Universal translators?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, man, if you've seen the advertising for the Pixel 2 from Google, you know those things are here. You put an earpiece in your ear, and you plug it into your smartphone, and someone can speak to you in their native language, and your software can automatically translate that with only a few seconds of delay. Thanks to natural language processing technology, it gets repeated back to you in your native language in your ear. Then you speak, and the computer can translate your speech into whatever language you want and send it off to someone else. Universal translators were something that, you know, you remember a communications officer in the original Star Trek? They needed to be experts in languages. That's what Uhura was in the original Star Trek. In the prequel series, that's what Hitoshi Sato was in Enterprise. And yet now, universal translators will literally do anything. They will take any known language. You can say anything you want in it, and it will translate that meaning for meaning, not word for word, but actually according to meaning, into any other language you want and speak it to you. you could actually hear things in near real time thanks to the power of this technology. We're almost to the point, people think, where we could even learn a new language on the fly thanks to the power of this software.
Go back again with me to computing, because I did my doctoral dissertation using one of those computers that fills a glass room where you had to punch 80-column cards, and I think about even on the original Star Trek when they used the original pilot with Christopher Pike, and Spock was going to get piked to a place where he could enjoy living his life after the radiation bombardment. Well, he went into a room of computers who had reel-to-reel tapes on top of them. And so in the 60s, Star Trek didn't know what our storage devices would be like.
You know, magnetic tape has its uses. It's more durable than, say, optical storage for a lot of different applications because it doesn't scratch as much. But yeah, I mean, even in the next generation, you know, you had this enormous ship's computer. That's what we envisioned the ultimate in computing is. People didn't envision a decentralized internet where the entire knowledge base of all of humanity would be available at everyone's fingertips thanks to the power of these connections. Star Trek was unable to envision how the holodeck and holograms would work, and now we have technology, virtual reality, that combines not only an immersive sight and sound experience, but thanks to infrasonic sensors, they bring you touch ability. They've developed a computer program that they used at a demonstration where you could put on your VR goggles and helmet and see drops of water falling and hear the sound of dripping water falling. But when you reach out your hand, if you successfully put it under where the drop is, you not only see the splash and you hear the splash, but on your skin, these infrasound generators can cause you to feel that water splashing on your hand. And for that instant where that splash occurs, it actually feels wet on your skin, even though it's just a simulated sensation.
Fantastic. I think what we already can accomplish visually with light, if we can one day get to all the senses, we can have those holodeck experiences.
Can you imagine what it would be like to pump in smells and taste, to even feel things like hunger and satiety in your own body, to feel fatigue or the euphoria that you get when you touch something that has a unique sensation like velour? I mean, this is something that is actually becoming real. These are computational technologies that years ago they were only existing in our imaginations, and now they're a part of our reality.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look beyond that to civilian technologies, you start running into things like replicators, like we have 3D printers now. You know, in Star Trek The Next Generation, they came up with synthahol, an alcohol alternative that would taste the same, but that wouldn't have any of the bad effects, and that would be able to be flushed out of your system at a moment's notice, like when red alert goes off. Well, pharmacologically, we're well on our way to developing that we've got a whole class of drugs that can bind to the good receptors that the same effects of alcohol bind to, but that won't bind to the bad ones. So you can get the euphoria and the increased confidence without getting the drunkenness and the dehydration and the loss of equilibrium and the dead brain cells. We've even started to come up with antidotes to that, where you take a pill and it kicks those drunken molecules out of their receptors so that you can go back to your normal sober life on a moment's notice. It's incredible how much is becoming reality, not just with computational technology, but with biotechnology as well.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I do dream that synthahol will become part of my lifetime could solve a world of problems. We didn't even get to the medical, and there's so many wonderful things in here, and it's especially noteworthy that tricorders are pretty much a reality already for various medical uses, and There's so much in this book worth reading. It's a delight, even if you're not as big a Star Trek fan as I am, and I think Dr. Siegel is. The book is by Ethan Siegel. It's called Star Trek Treknology, The Science of Star Trek from Tricorders to Warp Drive. And it's an easy read, and it's full of pictures that bring back memories of my favorite show of all time. I'm Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can catch up with us on YouTube, and our channel is Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.